Your last morning of peace begins now. Wake up to the truth, Kara.
The disposable camera clicked one last time as Mason Hartwell watched his wife climb into his brother's truck at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night that would change everything. Through the cracked windshield of his delivery van, parked 3 blocks away in the shadows of Millfield's abandoned steel plant, he counted the seconds they spent kissing before Kara finally pulled away and walked toward their front door. 43 seconds. 43 seconds that erased 18 years of marriage, 2 mortgages, and every shared memory that had meant anything to him. Mason lowered the camera and stared at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. That was the strangest part. For weeks, his hands had trembled every time he thought about what he suspected. Now, with proof burning in his palm like a piece of evidence that could destroy lives, his hands were steady as stone. He started the van and drove the long way home, taking the route through downtown Millfield that passed all the closed storefronts and empty lots where prosperity used to live. The dashboard clock read 12:03 a.m. when he pulled into his driveway. The house was dark except for the porch light Kara always left on for him after his late deliveries. Inside, she was already in bed, covers pulled up to her chin, breathing the deep, even breaths of someone who had no trouble sleeping. Mason stood in the doorway for a full minute, studying her face in the dim light from the hallway. She looked peaceful, innocent, like the woman he'd married 19 years ago when they were both young and stupid and thought love was enough to build a life on. "You're late," she murmured without opening her eyes. "Traffic," Mason said. It was easier than explaining he'd spent 3 hours following her and his brother Jace through their Tuesday night routine of lies. "There's leftover meatloaf in the fridge." "Thanks." He changed into his pajamas and brushed his teeth like it was any other night, like he hadn't just photographed his wife betraying him with the only family he had left. Like the foundation of his entire existence hadn't just crumbled into dust. In the kitchen, he sat at the table and ate cold meatloaf while staring at the disposable camera. 27 pictures. 27 pieces of evidence documenting 3 weeks of surveillance he'd hoped would prove him wrong. Instead, they'd proven him right in ways that made his stomach turn. The first photo was innocent enough. Kara leaving the real estate office where she worked part-time, talking on her phone. The second showed her getting into Jace's truck instead of her own car, which was supposedly in the shop. By the 20th photo, they were at the Riverside Motel on Route 9. And by the 27th, Mason had documentation of an affair that had probably been going on for months. He finished the meatloaf and washed the dish. Dried it, put it away. Normal motions for a normal night in a normal marriage that no longer existed. Upstairs, Kara was still sleeping, still breathing those peaceful breaths. Mason lay down beside her and stared at the ceiling until dawn crept through the blinds. Somewhere in those hours between midnight and sunrise, the man he'd been for 42 years quietly died, and someone else took his place. Someone who understood that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created. The next morning, Kara made coffee and toast like she always did, humming while she moved around the kitchen in her bathrobe and slippers. She kissed his forehead before he left for work, and Mason almost flinched at the casual intimacy of it. "I'll be home late tonight," she said. "Book club." "Which book?" The question caught her off guard. In 18 years of marriage, he'd never asked about her book club selections. It's a romance novel." "You wouldn't like it." "Try me." "The Bridges of Madison County." Mason nodded and kissed her goodbye. The lie came so easily to her, he wondered how many others he'd missed over the years. There was no book club. Tuesday nights were her standing appointment with Jace at whatever cheap motel they'd picked for the week. Thursday nights, too, based on his surveillance. Always the same pattern. She'd leave work early, meet Jace at his gym, and disappear for 3 hours before coming home with some excuse about errands or friends or volunteer work. He'd been tracking their movements for 3 weeks now, ever since he'd started noticing the small things that didn't add up. The new underwear, the way she turned her phone face down during dinner, the sudden interest in jogging when she'd never exercised a day in her life, the credit card charges at restaurants he'd never been to. Mason drove his delivery route on autopilot, his mind working through possibilities. He could confront them directly, but that would only lead to denials and gaslighting. He could file for divorce, but in a no-fault state like Pennsylvania, he'd lose half of everything and probably end up paying her alimony. He could do nothing and live with the knowledge that his wife and brother thought he was too stupid to figure out what they were doing. Or he could do something else entirely. The idea came to him while he was delivering a package to the industrial district on the east side of town. Rows of abandoned warehouses and empty lots stretched as far as he could see, casualties of the economic collapse that had hollowed out Millfield like a cancer. But in all that emptiness, he spotted something useful. A small garage bay with a "for rent" sign that looked like it had been there for months. Mason parked the van and walked over to check it out. The garage was maybe 20 by 30 feet with a roll-up door, concrete floors, and electrical service. The kind of space where a man could work on projects without interference. The kind of space where a man could plan. He called the number on the sign from a payphone at the gas station across the street. The landlord was eager to make a deal. $200 a month, first month up front, no questions asked as long as the rent was paid on time. Mason told him his name was Frank Miller and paid cash from his emergency fund, the money he'd been saving for their 20th anniversary trip to Hawaii. By the end of the week, he had a key to his new workspace and a clear picture of what came next. The first step was intelligence gathering. Mason had always been good at being invisible. It was a skill that came with 20 years of delivering packages to people who barely acknowledged his existence. He used that invisibility now, tracking Kara and Jace's movements with the patience of a hunter who had all the time in the world. He learned that Jace's fitness training business was barely breaking even, kept afloat by loans from their mother and a handful of wealthy clients who paid premium rates for personal attention. He learned that Kara's real estate career was more successful than she'd let on, with commissions she'd been hiding in a separate bank account. He learned that they'd been planning this affair for months, maybe years, building towards some kind of endgame that probably involved her leaving him for his brother. The second step was preparation. Mason began visiting the garage every evening after work, telling Kara he was picking up overtime shifts. He installed a small TV, a mini fridge, and a cot. He bought a police scanner and a collection of prepaid phones. He created a timeline of their activities and pinned it to the wall like a detective working a case. Most importantly, he started getting in shape. Not the flashy gym rat kind of fitness that Jace promoted, but the practical, functional strength that came from hard work and discipline. He did push-ups and sit-ups and pull-ups until his muscles screamed. He ran the abandoned railroad tracks that cut through the industrial district until his lungs burned. He wanted to be ready for whatever came next. The third step was psychological warfare. It started small. Mason created an anonymous email account and sent Jace's business landlord photos of health code violations at the gym, towels left unwashed, equipment improperly maintained, safety protocols ignored. Within a week, Jace was dealing with surprise inspections and formal complaints that threatened his business license. Then Mason called Kara's real estate broker, again anonymously, with concerns about her handling of client funds. Nothing illegal, just enough questions to trigger an internal audit that would tie up her commissions for months. The beauty of it was the randomness. Neither Kara nor Jace could connect their sudden problems to Mason because he was just the invisible husband, the reliable delivery driver who came home every night and ate dinner and watched TV like nothing had changed. But Mason was changing. Every night in the garage, working out and planning and preparing for the next phase, he could feel himself becoming someone different, someone harder. Someone who understood that nice guys didn't just finish last, they finished alone and betrayed and forgotten. His daughter Mira noticed the change first. She was 17, smart as a whip, and perceptive in the way that teenagers could be when they weren't buried in their phones. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked one evening when he came home from the garage. "You seem different lately." "Different how?" "I don't know, quieter. Like you're thinking about something all the time." Mason looked at his daughter, tall and thin like her mother, but with his dark eyes and stubborn chin, and wondered how much she knew. Teenagers were expert lie detectors when it came to their parents. They could sense dysfunction from a mile away. "Just work stuff," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Mira was right. He was different. The old Mason would have confronted Kara directly, demanded explanations, pleaded for another chance. The new Mason understood that confrontation was just another word for weakness. The new Mason was playing a longer game. 3 weeks into his campaign of psychological warfare, Mason escalated to the next level. He'd been monitoring police radio traffic for weeks, learning the patterns of patrol schedules and response times. He knew that Tuesday nights were slow in the industrial district, with most officers focused on downtown bar fights and domestic disputes. He also knew that Jace had started parking his truck in different locations for his meetings with Kara, probably worried about being seen. On a cold Tuesday in November, Mason waited in the shadows outside the Sleep As Inn on Route 9 until Jace emerged from room 237 at 10:30 p.m. Kara had left 10 minutes earlier, as was their pattern. Jace always stayed behind to shower and clean up, trying to eliminate any evidence of their meetings. Mason was waiting by Jace's truck when his brother walked out of the motel. He wore a ski mask and dark clothing, carrying a tire iron he'd found in one of the abandoned warehouses. "What the heck?" Jace started to say, but Mason was already moving. He swung the tire iron at Jace's knee, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to drop him. Then he stood over his brother and spoke in a voice he'd been practicing for weeks, deeper and rougher than his normal tone. "Stay away from married women." Jace tried to get up, and Mason hit him again, this time in the ribs. Not to seriously injure, just to make a point. "I said stay away from married women." "Who are you?" Jace gasped, clutching his side. Mason didn't answer. He just walked away, disappearing into the darkness between the motel and the highway. By the time Jace called 911, Mason was already back in his van, driving home through the back roads of Millfield like he'd never left. The police report listed it as a random mugging, though nothing was stolen. Jace spent the night in the emergency room getting x-rays that showed bruised ribs and a slightly torn meniscus. He told the investigating officers he had never seen his attacker before, couldn't identify him, had no idea why anyone would want to hurt him. But Mason knew that Jace was smart enough to connect the dots. The warning about married women wasn't subtle. It was meant to plant seeds of paranoia, to make Jace wonder if someone knew about the affair and was willing to do something about it. The next morning, Kara was unusually agitated. She kept checking her phone and making excuses to leave the house. When Mason asked if everything was okay, she snapped at him about leaving dirty dishes in the sink. Classic deflection behavior, he realized. She was stressed about something but couldn't tell him what. "I heard there was an incident at that motel on Route 9 last night," Mason said casually while reading the newspaper. "Some guy got mugged in the parking lot." Kara froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Really? That's terrible." "Yeah, the article says it might have been random, but you never know. Could have been someone who knew the victim. Maybe he was doing something he shouldn't have been doing." She set down her coffee cup harder than necessary. "Why would you say that?" "Just thinking out loud. Sometimes people get hurt because they put themselves in dangerous situations." Mason watched his wife's face and saw the fear creeping in. She was smart enough to know that attacks on cheating spouses weren't unheard of. She was also smart enough to know that her husband wasn't as oblivious as he pretended to be, but she wasn't smart enough to stop seeing Jace. The affair continued, just with more precautions. They changed motels more frequently, met at different times, used cash instead of credit cards, all of which made them easier to track because predictable patterns were harder to hide than random ones. Mason began phase 2 of his plan. He'd been studying Kara's real estate business for weeks, learning about her clients and deals and professional relationships. What he discovered was that her success came from cutting corners and bending rules in ways that weren't illegal but weren't exactly ethical either. She had a talent for manipulation that served her well in sales but could be turned against her with the right pressure. Mason started with her biggest client, a wealthy developer named Patricia Vance, who was looking to buy commercial properties in the downtown area. Using one of his anonymous email accounts, Mason sent Patricia documentation of Kara's hidden bank account and evidence that she'd been skimming commission fees from other clients. He presented it as a concerned citizen looking out for local investors. The result was exactly what Mason had hoped for. Patricia pulled out of her deals with Kara and spread the word through Millfield's tight-knit business community that Kara Hartwell might not be trustworthy. Within 2 weeks, Kara lost 3 major clients and saw her income drop by 60%. At the same time, Mason escalated his campaign against Jace. He called the health department with reports of unsanitary conditions at the gym. He contacted the Better Business Bureau with complaints about fraudulent advertising and unsafe training practices. He even called Jace's ex-fiancée, Sarah, who lived in Pittsburgh now, and anonymously informed her that Jace was sleeping with married women. Sarah, it turned out, had been looking for an excuse to cause trouble for Jace ever since their messy breakup 2 years earlier. She started calling his current clients, warning them about his character issues and suggesting they might want to find a different trainer. Within a month, Jace's business was hemorrhaging clients and struggling to pay basic expenses. The pressure was building on both sides of the affair, but Mason wasn't finished. He was just getting started. The breakthrough came when Mason intercepted a text message exchange between Kara and Jace. He'd been monitoring their phones using a technique he'd learned from YouTube videos. Nothing high-tech, just basic knowledge about how to clone SIM cards and redirect messages. What he found was better than he'd hoped for. They were planning to leave town together. Jace had found a gym in Florida that was for sale, and Kara had enough money saved to help him buy it. They were going to wait until after the holidays, file for divorce, and start fresh in a place where nobody knew about their affair. The timeline gave Mason exactly what he needed: a deadline and a target. He spent the next week preparing for the final phase of his plan. He rented a second storage unit under another false name and filled it with supplies, rope, tarps, tools, and enough non-perishable food to last a month. He studied the layout of the abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of town, the place where he planned to hold his final confrontation. Most importantly, he began preparing his daughter for what was coming. "Mira," he said one evening when they were alone in the house, "I need to show you something." He took her to the garage and revealed everything: the surveillance photos, the timeline, the evidence of the affair. He watched his daughter's face crumble as the truth sank in. "Mom and Uncle Jace," she whispered. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Mira stared at the photos for a long time, tears streaming down her cheeks. When she finally looked up at her father, her expression was different. Harder. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make them understand what they've done." "Will you hurt them?" Mason considered the question carefully. "I'm going to give them exactly what they deserve." Mira nodded slowly. At 17, she was old enough to understand that some betrayals couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. She was also old enough to choose sides. "I'll help you," she said. The final phase began on a cold Thursday in December. Mason had spent weeks preparing the textile factory, setting up the space like a courtroom where he would serve as judge, jury, and executioner. Not literally. He wasn't planning to kill anyone, but he was planning to destroy them in ways that would last longer than any physical injury. The factory was perfect for his purposes. Built in the 1940s, it had been abandoned for 15 years, long enough for the city to forget about it, but not long enough for it to become structurally unsafe. The main floor was a vast open space with concrete floors and industrial lighting that still worked if you knew which breakers to flip. The loading dock provided easy access for vehicles, and the office spaces on the second floor offered privacy for extended conversations. Mason had been setting up for weeks, installing generators, running extension cords, and creating what he thought of as his courtroom. He'd covered the walls with blown-up photos from his surveillance images of Kara and Jace at various motels, restaurants, and parking lots. He'd printed out copies of their text messages and email exchanges. He'd created a timeline of their affair that stretched across one entire wall like a prosecutor's case presentation. The centerpiece was a pair of chairs in the middle of the room, positioned so that his wife and brother would have to face each other and the evidence of their betrayal. Mason had practiced his speech dozens of times, refining the words until they carried the perfect weight of judgment and disappointment. Getting them to the factory required careful orchestration. Mason created fake job opportunities for both of them, a real estate development project for Kara and a corporate fitness contract for Jace. Both opportunities were too good to pass up, especially given their recent financial troubles. Both required in-person meetings at the textile factory, which Mason described as the potential site for their respective projects. Kara arrived first at 7 p.m. on Thursday evening, December 18th. Mason watched from the shadows as she parked her car and walked toward the loading dock entrance, wearing her best business suit and carrying a briefcase full of documents she'd prepared for the fake meeting. When she stepped into the main floor and saw the walls covered with photos of her affair, she froze. For a moment, Mason thought she might run. Instead, she did something that surprised him. She started laughing. "Oh my God," she said, looking around at the elaborate display. "Mason, is this really you? Did you actually do all this?" Her laughter wasn't nervous or scared. It was the kind of laughter that came from genuine amusement, like she'd discovered something ridiculous and couldn't believe it was real. Mason stepped out of the shadows, no longer trying to hide his identity. "Hello, Kara. This is insane." "You're actually insane." She gestured at the photos and documents covering the walls. "How long have you been planning this? Months?" "Long enough." "And you think this is going to accomplish what, exactly? You think you're going to scare me into coming back to you? You think you're going to threaten me into being the wife you want?" Mason walked to the center of the room and stood beside the chairs he'd arranged. "I think you're going to sit down and listen to what I have to say." "No, I don't think I am." Kara moved toward the exit, but Mason had anticipated this. He'd locked the loading dock entrance after she came in, and the other exits required keys that only he possessed. "The doors are locked," he said calmly. For the first time, fear flickered across Kara's face. "Mason, unlock the doors." "This isn't funny anymore. It was never meant to be funny." That's when they heard the second car pulling up outside, Jace's truck right on schedule. Mason had timed the meeting so that his brother would arrive while Kara was still processing the situation. Maximum psychological impact. Jace entered through the same door, limping slightly from his encounter with Mason's tire iron weeks earlier. When he saw Kara standing in the middle of the photo-covered room, he stopped dead. "What the hell is this?" "Your brother's finally lost his mind," Kara said. "He's been stalking us for months, taking pictures, playing detective. And now he's locked us in here for some kind of confrontation." Jace looked around at the evidence of their affair displayed like an art gallery exhibition. "Jesus, Mason, how long have you known?" "Long enough to document everything. Long enough to ruin both your businesses. Long enough to make you wonder who else might be watching you." The realization hit Jace like a physical blow. The mugging, the business problems, the health department inspections. "That was all you?" Mason nodded. "Just the beginning." "You son of a witch!" Jace started toward his brother, but Mason pulled out a tool he'd bought from a private seller at the show 3 months earlier. "Sit down," Mason said quietly. The Colt changed everything. Kara and Jace moved to the chairs, no longer treating this as an elaborate prank or a psychological breakdown. This was real, and Mason was in complete control. "You want to know what happens next?" Mason asked, keeping the tool trained on both of them. "I'm going to tell you a story about two people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Two people who thought they could lie and cheat and betray the people who trusted them without any consequences." He began walking around the room, pointing to different photos and documents as he spoke. His voice was calm, almost conversational, which made the words more terrifying than any amount of shouting would have been. "This is a photo of you two at the Riverside Motel on October 15th. This is a text message from November 2nd where you discuss leaving town together. This is a bank statement showing the account where you've been hiding money from me for 8 months. Kara tried to interrupt, but Mason kept talking. "This is a timeline of every lie you told me. Every excuse about book clubs and yoga classes and volunteer work. Every time you looked me in the eye and made me feel like I was paranoid for suspecting what you were doing." He stopped in front of Jace's chair. "And this is a record of every client you've lost because someone started asking questions about your business practices. Every inspection, every complaint, every problem that's been destroying your livelihood piece by piece." "Mason, we can work this out," Jace said. "We can figure out a way to make this right." "Can we? Can you undo 18 years of marriage? Can you give me back the trust I had in the only family I had left?" Mason moved to stand between the two chairs, looking down at his wife and brother like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit here and listen to me explain exactly what you've destroyed. Then you're going to face each other and explain why you thought it was acceptable to betray someone who loved you both. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense psychological confrontation any of them had ever experienced. Mason methodically detailed every piece of evidence he'd gathered, every lie they'd told, every moment when they'd chosen selfish desire over loyalty and trust. He made them read their own text messages aloud. He made them look at photos of themselves kissing and touching and laughing while he'd been home alone, wondering why his wife was so distant. The worst part wasn't the evidence of their affair. The worst part was discovering how long they'd been planning it, how carefully they'd manipulated him, how little respect they'd had for his intelligence or his feelings. "You thought I was stupid," Mason said during one of the most devastating moments. "You thought I was just the boring husband who delivered packages and watched TV and didn't notice when his wife started wearing different underwear. You thought I was invisible?" Kara was crying by then, but Mason wasn't sure if the tears were from guilt or frustration at being caught. "We never meant for it to happen," she said. "It just did. We tried to stop, but we couldn't help ourselves." "You couldn't help yourselves?" Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. "You couldn't help lying to me for months? You couldn't help planning to abandon me for a new life in Florida? You couldn't help making me feel like I was losing my mind when I started noticing that something was wrong?" Jace tried a different approach. "Look, I know we screwed up. I know we hurt you. But keeping us here like this isn't going to fix anything. It's just going to make everything worse." "Worse for who?" "For you. You're going to go to prison for kidnapping. You're going to lose your daughter, your job, everything you have left." Mason smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "You still don't understand, do you? I've already lost everything that mattered to me. My wife, my brother, my family, my trust in the people I loved most. What exactly do you think you can threaten me with now?" That's when they realized how far Mason had fallen, how completely their betrayal had transformed him. This wasn't the man they'd known for years. This was someone new, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from their destruction. The final phase of Mason's plan wasn't about physical violence. It was about something much more devastating: public humiliation and social destruction. While Kara and Jace were locked in the factory confronting their crimes, Mason's daughter Mira was executing the final phase of their plan. She had copies of all the evidence her father had gathered, and she was systematically destroying her mother's and uncle's reputations throughout Millfield. She sent the affair documentation to Kara's employer, her clients, her friends, and her family. She posted the text messages on social media, tagged every person who knew them, and made sure the entire community would see exactly what kind of people they were. She did the same with Jace's professional contacts, his remaining clients, and his social circle. By the time Mason released them from the factory at 3 a.m., their lives had been completely dismantled. Their secrets were public, their businesses were destroyed, and their reputations were in ruins. "You're free to go," Mason told them as he unlocked the loading dock door. "But before you leave, I want you to understand something. This isn't the end. This is the beginning. Every day for the rest of your lives, you're going to remember what you did and what it cost you. Every time you meet someone new, you're going to wonder if they know about your affair. Every time you try to start over, you're going to carry this with you." Kara and Jace stumbled out into the cold December night, physically unharmed but psychologically destroyed. They didn't speak to each other or to Mason. They just got in their cars and drove away in different directions. Mason watched them go, then turned off the generators and locked up the factory. His revenge was complete, but it had cost him more than he'd expected. Looking at himself in the reflection of the factory windows, he barely recognized the man staring back. The betrayal had broken him, but the revenge had rebuilt him into someone harder and colder than he'd ever imagined he could become. The aftermath played out over the following months exactly as Mason had predicted. Kara lost her real estate license and ended up working at a grocery store in the next town over. Jace's gym failed completely, and he moved back in with their mother, broken and defeated. Their affair died under the weight of public scrutiny and mutual blame. Neither of them pressed charges against Mason. How could they? Any legal action would have required them to admit publicly what they'd done, and their reputations were already destroyed. They'd lost the war before they'd even realized they were fighting one. Mason kept his job and his house, but his marriage was obviously over. He and Kara divorced quietly, splitting their assets according to Pennsylvania law. She moved to Philadelphia to start over where nobody knew her story. He stayed in Millfield, living alone in the house where he'd once been happy. Mira chose to live with her father, and together they began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. She was accepted to college with a full scholarship, and Mason was proud of her resilience and strength. She'd seen the worst of human nature, but hadn't let it destroy her faith in the possibility of love and trust. 6 months after the confrontation at the factory, Mason received an unexpected letter. It was from a literary agent in New York who had somehow heard about his story. She wanted to know if he'd be interested in writing a book about revenge, about what happened when ordinary people were pushed too far by betrayal. Mason read the letter twice, then put it in his desk drawer. He wasn't ready to share his story with the world. Maybe he never would be. Instead, he drove to the industrial district one last time, to the factory where he'd held his final judgment. The building was being demolished to make room for a new shopping center, another attempt to revitalize Millfield's struggling economy. In the rubble, Mason found a piece of the loading dock sign that had marked the entrance to his courtroom. He took it home and put it in his garage, a reminder of the night when he'd stopped being a victim and started being something else entirely. On the kitchen table, he found a note from Mira. She was spending the weekend with friends and would be back Sunday night. The house was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. Mason made himself dinner and ate it slowly, thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He wasn't the same man who had discovered his wife's affair. That man had been trusting, forgiving, willing to believe the best about the people he loved. This man knew better. This man understood that some betrayals were too deep to forgive and too devastating to forget. Looking at his reflection in the kitchen window, Mason saw a stranger with hard eyes and a mouth that rarely smiled. The old Mason would have been horrified by what he'd become. The new Mason was simply grateful to have survived the transformation. Some ashes don't scatter, he thought, remembering the factory sign in his garage. They wait. And Mason Hartwell was very good at waiting.